friends. Thanks for taking time to listen in on part one of a conversation Dick and I had about the Brazilian Grand Prix, US Grand Prix in Las Vegas, and the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. John couldn't join us for this discussion, but Dick and I made sure to connect for this final month of racing in the 2023 calendar. As you'll hear, we both think this month's races reinforce the historic aspect of this moment in F1, both as a result of this year's newest race on the calendar, Las Vegas, and Red Bull's continued dominance. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Dick, this is the last monthly review for this 2023 F1 calendar season. I don't know.
Where did the year go?
I know. I don't know what to think. Like, it's a little bittersweet. We're actually recording it on Sunday after the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. I'm still processing that. John couldn't join us, but I know that he is really excited to hear our comments, and we both are looking forward to a conversation together to process not just the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, but also the Las Vegas and the Brazil Grand Prix as well, all of this month's races. Brazil, what was your highlight?
Oh, it was just the battle between Alonso and Perez. Sergio threw everything but the kitchen sink at old Fernando, and Fernando just really didn't care. He was having none of it. And kept his head, figured out a way to make that the widest race car that has ever been produced. And even when Sergio finally got around him, here came Fred, right back at him and in front of him. And I don't know, I think they crossed the finish line like a couple thousandths of a second apart or some crazy number like that. And so, man, what a battle. And, the thing is that the pressure that Sergio was putting on Fernando was enormous. It's much harder to lead and defend than to be the one on attack, because if you're the one on attack, you have nothing to lose. There's no pressure. Nobody's trying to pass you. You're trying to get around the guy in front of you. And so, somebody has likened it to a World War II dogfight, and
Ooh, that's good.
Right. It's like the Spitfire versus the Messerschmitt, or the P-51 against the Messerschmitt, whatever. And, they're out positioning each other, out maneuvering each other. And yet you got the feeling about the only other thing that Sergio might have been able to do is just ram up Fernando, because it was, he'd run out of bullets.
It's the truth. I mean, I feel like someone said that, like, he was on his gearbox, like they might as well have been one car. I when we were preparing for this, we discussed this moment, and I wrote in my notes that it was a masterclass in defensive driving. I think that it's so interesting to watch that last second. Like, it was a very good race, right? I thought it was a fantastic race. Kind of giving a sneak peek to our listeners is that we're going to talk about the circuits and tracks. It's that we've already recorded and probably release in the near future. But if my memory serves me correctly, Interlagos is one of your favorite tracks of the year, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was a track when, I was, I'm using this in air quotes, but when I was, the jet setting global consultant, which, by the way, is not glamorous at all. I was in Sao Paulo, Brazil, which just happens to be where, Interlagos is located. And I literally was on the other side of a hill. The office that I was working out of was on the other side of a hill from the track. And so one weekend I rented a car and went out and kind of snuck in I did sneak on the track, and, really got to look at the place. And like you see the cars are going downhill out of turn one and turn two. But I'm here to tell you what, the TV flattens that out quite a bit. It's a serious drop. And then the climb back up the hill, obviously, what goes up must come down. And so the climb back up the hill on the other side of the track is also pretty significant. Maybe not to the significance of like a Road Atlanta. If you've ever been to that track, there's some amazing up and down at Road Atlanta where you're just kind of like, how on earth are you going to do that? Well, the answer is pretty well, actually. And Sao Paulo is every bit as serious in terms of that drop. So it's pretty impressive.
Well, it's interesting because I was reading online one article, and so I sometimes, depending on the article, will scan the comments. One person said, interesting, isn't it? Interlagos does not meet any of the current requirements for F1 races, but it still gets a contract and undoubtedly provides excellent old track style of racing.
Yep.
That was one comment. The other one that I liked was this person said, along with the tracks like Spa, Suzuka, and Monza, Interlagos is part of the DNA of modern F1. It might not have all the sweet facilities the new tracks have, but it is an amazing to drive with difficult combinations of corners and elevation changes that seem lacking in the new ones. And of course, as the old tracks are lined with gravel and grass, we don't hear about track limits 3 weeks after the race. We have to wait 7 hours for the stewards to work through 1,500 potential violation. And then the person said, lose these tracks and you lose what made F1 so great, and what you're left with, who knows? And when I read that, I actually thought of you in the conversation about how we've been frustrated this year about track limits consistently being discussed. Sure. Again, maybe it's what I've realized from the conversation with you and with John is that I am a race purist. And I'm like, wow, this person wrote something that makes a lot of sense. Like, we've gone so far into the tech. What if we went back to a little bit more of the old school racing style? Sure. Would that actually mitigate some of the very things that we keep trying to use technology? I say that knowing that I read online that they're looking at AI to help in some of this track limits. I just thought that was interesting, especially on the heels of you talking about the fact that you've actually been there and been able to sneak onto the track. The other thing I will highlight that I found notable for this race, and this is again probably because I am a Charles Leclerc fan, was that business of the electrical issue affecting the shutdown of the hydraulic and I think the engine, both, right, if I remember correctly. Like, what he said was what I felt. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, how unlucky can he be? The reason I bring this up, again, kind of going back to earlier eras, it made me want to ask you about the question of reliability in general. It seems that I feel like you and John have mentioned this, that reliability isn't a question we really have in this modern era of F1. Right. But in previous years, was this more likely to happen, or were you not as shocked back then?
Yeah, I mean, it's hilarious in some respects. If you think about like the Formula One in the 60s, 70s, and really probably up to the mid 80s anyway, the cars were actually quite simple. The engines, yes, they had fuel injection, but, until the turbos came out in the late 70s, there wasn't a whole lot of plumbing and all that kind of stuff. And yet they were blowing those things up right and left. I mean, it was normal. People would go, oh, he's dropped an exhaust valve. You can hear it, and, there's 2 laps to go in the race. Maybe he'll finish. One of those kind of deals. And of course, they had 12 cylinders back then on some of the cars. And so it's like, well, if he loses a cylinder, he's still got 11. It's one of those deals. But and then you look at the cars today and they're phenomenally complicated, right? And yet the reliability generally is really, really good. It's super impressive. And of course, some of that is, hey, you got manufacturing techniques that are light years ahead of what they had 50 or 60 years ago, right? Or the materials are better. You've got, CAD CAM, which, there was nothing like that back in those days. And so, it just all adds up. That's just better manufacturing, better design, better, everything. And I mean, one of the big steps back in the 60s and 70s was realizing that, hey, you know what? Things like the Federal Aviation Administration, they really don't like airplanes falling out of the sky. It's just bad PR, And so airplanes are actually pretty reliable, and we've got airplanes sort of. Wonder what they're doing. And it was just simple. Hey, let's use aircraft quality nuts and bolts and rod ends and bushings and stuff like that. And let's see what happens. And all of a sudden, voila, a lot of the breakdowns that were happening all the time was eliminated because they were just using aircraft quality materials, And so, the whole carbon fiber tub that they use these days, I mean, that came straight out of the aerospace industry. So there's a lot of it where there's, the Department of Defense would come up with some cool idea for some manufacturing process or whatever, and it eventually finds its way to Formula One.
That's the part that I really enjoy And I hope that other fans, especially new fans, will realize the progress that the sport has been able to make, and that what we're witnessing today, and that as much as my heart sank as a Charles Leclerc fan, I also should be like the fact that that was probably expected in earlier eras, and that doesn't detract from the driver or the team,
right?
Because really these things were happening
They do
to a
happen.
much larger scale.
And
Okay.
Charles too, if you're a fan of Roadrunner and Coyote cartoons, there's the what I call the cartoon anvil from the Acme Manufacturing Company, where the anvil
Yes.
just falls onto the top of Wile E. Coyote. Yeah, I think Charles can really, really sympathize with Wile E. Coyote. In fact, Wile E. Coyote may be Charles's new hero. I'm not sure,
Oh
but
no.
I'm thinking.
I hope not, because it's a perpetual problem. I want him to get out of the cycle. Like, let's not. We'll say that was the 2023 year.
Yeah,
Let
that's right.
2024 starts a new horizon.
That's
You're
right.
gonna make it through. Okay, well, let's move on to the Las Vegas Grand Prix. What
Yep.
was your highlight there?
Just the fact that the race over delivered, because I was fortunate. I actually drove on part of the track like 2 weeks before the race. I was seriously impressed by all the infrastructure that had been put in. And, the track surface to me looked like it was about as smooth as the top of a pool table. It's just clearly a lot of money. Just the lighting system is just crazy, man. When you look at it up close, it's like this very intricate lattice work of aluminum beams, basically, that's been put together, and it's incredibly impressive what they had done. But I was sort of like, well, I don't know that this track's going to promote good racing. I hate the fact that it's starting as late as it's starting. What's the temperatures going to be like in the desert in November in Las Vegas, which I can tell you it's going to be cold. And, I just had a lot of doubts. And I think those were doubts that were shared by the majority of the F1 paddock. And, they didn't have any support races. It was just this race. And so I thought, okay, what we're going to have is a bunch of rich posers coming in for the various parties. And oh, by the way, there's this race going on, and yeah, we may go look at it, but whatever, $11,000 a seat or whatever crazy number they're paying for tickets. The ordinary fan really didn't have much chance to go to this race. And so I'm thinking about all these negatives, and I'm just going to be like, yeah, going to be a good show. And I was happily surprised because it was a heck of a race. That track actually turned out to be really racy. And I think that F1 may have learned something, in that there were several passing zones where they were at the end of long straightaways where you really had to get on the brakes to pass somebody and outbrake them into the corner. Well, there's a lot of tracks where you just don't do that, because the straights aren't that long and the corners aren't that slow at the end of the straight. So in many respects, the layout of Vegas actually came right on race day, and it provided a really fun race to watch. I was shocked.
So I agree, and I guess not necessarily disagree as much as I remain neutral. I think that was what I took beforehand, right? Like, I was trying to be fair in all the anti-pro voices of this race, and I still feel unsettled about it. And I feel like maybe it's because I need more data. I need more time to kind of think through this. I agree with you that I think it made good racing. I would say, and again, I'm the non-racer, and I'm definitely not the technical person that you are. So I caveat all that. You can totally squash me down when I say what I say next. Okay. I think that the layout was good for all the reasons that you said, but I also think the reason why this was a good race is that nobody had data. Nobody had history. And so everyone was kind of on an equal foot, even Red Bull, that they didn't know what to expect. And so the racing put everybody kind of on an edge of, okay, we're just going to do it. Can you do that again next year or in future years? I don't know. Like, I especially like if we were to take the same car and all the same drivers and do this again in 2 years, like nothing changed, I would imagine because they're all so smart, they would all tweak their car setup, learn that from you. They would
Yep.
all know how to manage their tire, learn that from you.
Mm-hmm.
And they would also take into account all the weather and all this other stuff. And because of the packed calendar, they would also know how to manage like the mental challenge, the physical challenge.
Right.
And so then, assuming that the regs, again, of course, I realize in 2 years the regs will change, but say that the regs didn't change, all things being equal, I walked away from the weekend thinking, yeah, it didn't destroy, it didn't destroy the my perception, but it also didn't, I mean, not my perception. It did not destroy the experience, but it also didn't make me think that this is what I will see again next
Right.
year. Does that all
Right.
make sense?
Yeah, no, and that's fair. I do think that they're going to make some changes from lessons learned. Like
Mm-hmm.
they're not going to race that late at night. I
Mm-hmm.
think they're going to do more of an Abu Dhabi kind of thing where they start and maybe it's, the sun is either just set or is about to set, one of those kind of deals.
Mm-hmm.
Because the teams themselves have said, hey, look, it's just too hard on our bodies,
Oh my word.
right?
Without a doubt. Like, well,
Yeah.
so I have a whole bunch of notes, and we can give this heads up to our listeners that hopefully you and I can do a follow-up conversation.
Yeah, let's
I
do it.
don't know, because I have so many more thoughts about this. Out of all my notes, I think I spent much more on Las Vegas. But the timing, I mean, you knew this because I messaged you and John. I stayed up for literally everything,
Right.
even FP2 and its delayed start. And I was thinking to myself, all I have to do is sit here. I'm not having to do the work of the F1 circuit and or be the driver that has to
Right.
get into that car going hurtling down the road at that high of a speed and keep it all together. I thought to myself, how is this not thought about for just the people who are putting on the show and the experience? That made me really frustrated for them.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I heard like a lot of the rationale for, having a third race is for the American audience, I thought this isn't really conducive to the American audience. Like,
No,
I'm
not at all.
like the weirdo who's sitting up and waiting for all this. I know
Right.
there's not many people doing this. I am glad to know that they are looking to change the time. I think that also they need to consider the change in where this lands in the calendar. I
Mm-hmm.
can't even imagine how exhausted they are going from Las Vegas to Abu Dhabi after everything
Insane.
that they had to go through. It's insane.
Yep.
And I just don't, I think more from a safety and sustainability perspective, I don't, because I value what these people are doing and providing this type of entertainment, I really don't want to see them. I don't want to have any errors if we had just rejiggered this differently. And then going to the show aspect, to me, it seems like the show, and that can kind of lead into what we're talking about for Abu Dhabi. I felt like watching Abu Dhabi today, it was kind of like after having the Las Vegas. It almost seems like Las Vegas would have been a great ending for the season, and because of the show aspect, and it would have been a really great send-off for the season. I realize though that they have signed that agreement with Abu Dhabi, and I think it's also contingent when they sign it when in the calendar they are. But I mean, like for years it was those firecrackers, right? That are not firecrackers, fireworks that goes off when you win. But what is that in comparison now to the Las Vegas that was just a week before? Like as it was happening, I thought, well, that's kind of nice. But last week they had all this fanfare, all this stuff. And it just felt like that was the end of the year versus poor Abu Dhabi, which I wonder if there's a way for them to rejigger it so that Abu Dhabi doesn't feel shortchanged, but who knows? But that was my one of my takeaways.
Yeah, I mean the race. Look, I mean Abu Dhabi's an amazing place with the yachts, and it's Monaco in the middle of the desert, right? And the big hotel and all that. Because for the longest time, Abu Dhabi was everybody was like, "Whoa, this is a great place to go and finish up the season and all that kind of stuff." And now they're sitting there scratching their heads and they're kind of going, "We just got outdone," and so. They've got a year to figure it out. Is the way I look at it, because they were outdone. I mean, I don't know what else to say. Yeah.
Well, but you know what? I said let's go to Abu Dhabi, but I wanted to bring up one other thing from Las Vegas, which was the Norris accident. I felt so bad for McLaren. Well, first off, I felt sorry for Lando.
Sure.
When we're watching him we're watching the race, and then all of a sudden I remember that moment he kind of comes past the camera that the broadcasters were doing the show on, and you don't really quite understand where that's happening. All you saw was just a slide of him, not the full car. My heart dropped and I thought, what is going on? I am really glad that he got out of that car and was essentially okay. That goes to the testament to the development of these cars to such a level. I thought was wonderful. But I was also sad for McLaren because I know how much Lando brings to the team.
Right.
And he was truly brilliant ahead of that crash.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever they were doing over there, it just needs to continue, in my opinion, and they bring it up for the next years, because I really think that they've got the pieces and the people in to really be able to be contenders. And I really think that gap, but that crash worried me so much about, what would that mean for him if that, especially at that point in the year too, with them trying to have some break. And then I didn't want to see him laid up during winter testing.
Right.
Or winter break, I should say.
Yeah, during winter break. Yeah. I mean, that kind of stuff is going to happen, whether it's the beginning of the year or the end of the year. And I guess, from a practical point, if you're going to really wad it up and stove yourself in at the same time, better to do it at the end of the year than at the beginning of the year, because at least then you're not missing any races.
Well, that's true.
But still, I'm like you. I mean, in really, when we talk about the cartoon anvil, I mean, Lando's kind of had that on top of him too. Not to the degree that Charles has, but I mean, he certainly has had some kind of bizarre things happen to him where you just kind of go, what's up with that? One of those things. And the other part is Lando, this is the first time where he hasn't been necessarily the undisputed king of the hill. Piastri's pushing him for everything he's got. And he didn't have to deal with that with Ricardo.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and I really have been impressed with Lando. And I think I see similarities of him and Charles. I think that's why I like them. It was actually one of the statements that Lando made was really hard on himself. And I think that that's where I identify, is that he expects a lot of himself. He wants to do his best. And the people around him have encouraged him and nurtured him and trained him so well to really reach for his full potential. It's a matter of timing for both of them to show their skill and their ability. And which leads me to Abu Dhabi. I thought it was interesting that Mercedes edged out Ferrari. And Charles's little mental calculation about giving that toe to Sergio, doing that, it kind of felt reminiscent of Carlos and the Singapore and working with Lando there. That was for me one of the highlights. But then ultimately it did come short, in Mercedes edged them out, but just a few points.
Right.
But I don't necessarily know that I think that's a bad thing. But I wondered what your highlight was from the race.
Oh, I think it was just capping the season off by Red Bull with an exclamation point. Max did what Max does this year, which is just go and basically check out on everybody and then sit there and control the race and watch after his tires and, and basically manage the race. And again, I mean, this is one of those things where, this complete and utter domination that we've seen, that doesn't happen very often, thankfully. Although I will say in Formula One, it seems like since we've started in the new millennium, so to speak, you had Ferrari dominating with Schumacher in the early 2000s, and then you had Vettel winning the World Championship 4 years in a row, and then Mercedes comes along in the turbo hybrid era, and how many world championships did they win in a row? It's like 6 or 7. So we've seen this pattern of domination, and now we're back with Red Bull dominating. This is 3 years in a row, but this time, I mean, they destroyed the competition. I mean, there's nobody in the same zip code with these guys. And so, I think this is a really unique season. It's certainly one that I hope that we'll see competition next year. I really would not want to see another season like this, but big tip of the hat to Red Bull because they really, really got it right.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think largely I come to that conclusion because of the things that you and John have taught me over the course of this year of how to look at this. And I even think, I don't remember if it was a broadcaster or a commentary, or it might even been when I was watching the recent Braun GP series on Hulu. But I had this, someone mentioned that this is like a pyramid of development, that eventually everybody converges at the top, like the best rides. Right. And then that's, you have these seasons, you have these eras where that happens. And I thought to myself, well, that's very interesting. And all the more for those who are like, oh, I'm over F1, or who are new, should keep in mind that this is hopefully with the year change and the new development race that will start, just as much as the actual on-track race will each week change up, that these teams are moving, and we should hopefully see. I mean, I was surprised that Mercedes had to work so hard for P2. That right. I mean, I chalk it up to car design, and I hope that they're going to figure out, because I don't think it's strategy. That was my takeaway when I was looking at the standings this evening. And then I was surprised for Ferrari, such a historic team and always seen at the front of the pack, how hard it was for them to get to the point like of where they ended up, just a few points shy of P2. I expect better and more from them as well. I don't doubt that Carlos and Charles are doing their utmost, but I want the team to get their act together. And where I did see some glimmer of hope in both of these teams was Mercedes at least acknowledging that they had made a mistake and they were going to try to figure this out. And it seems like every race post summer they were testing different concepts and nothing was making sense. So I do think your hypothesis about how they may moving into the next year, I agree with. But then with Ferrari, it seems like post summer they were coming up with stuff and actually figuring out how to adjust the car and give their guys more opportunities. But I think it always keeps coming back to their teamwork and their strategy. It's not about their ability to build a good car. It seems like if they get the design correctly. You tell me, am I right or wrong on that?
Yeah, I mean, Mercedes has basically said, hey, look, this concept that we came up with for a ground effect car, it just doesn't work. It's just not good enough. And so we're scrapping that design as opposed to evolving the design, which is what most of the teams have done. And we're starting with a clean sheet of paper. You know, if you think about it, like the McLaren and the Aston Martin look a whole lot more like a Red Bull than they look like either the Mercedes or the Ferrari, right? Ferrari has gone down a different path. They've produced a car that, you know, in some respects is going to be similar to everything else on the grid, but the car does seem to work. I mean, it's on certain tracks, that car is a rocket. And so you look at that car and you kind of go, okay, you know, yes, it doesn't work everywhere, but man, in some places it works really well. And we've seen that, and they've definitely been narrowing the gap. Mercedes, you know, they're still complaining about, you know, the porpoising and all that. It's not as severe and it's not as often, but they still have the porpoising issues and stuff like that. And they're just like, yeah, this isn't working. So they're going with a clean sheet of paper. Interestingly enough, next year, the car that Aston Martin is producing, it's going to be a clean sheet of paper. You know, completely different design and all that. And given that, you know, their technical director is ex-Red Bull, I bet it looks a whole lot like an RB19, you know? So, yeah, I think that it's just really interesting to think about what may come out. I mean, you know, with McLaren, it's sort of like, okay, how do we squeeze a little bit more out of this car? And we're going to be there. You know, so that's going to be really interesting. I think
that is very interesting. If both Ferrari can enhance what they've already designed without a clean sheet of paper, as you said, and be competitive against a Red Bull and get their strategy together. Maybe we could see them challenging, which we do know that, I mean, considering they were the only team to actually win a race, that was with Carlos kind of overriding the strategy. I think that actually gives a little credence that may be where the Achilles heel is for the team right now. Going back to Las Vegas, I thought it was interesting with all the problems that they faced. Charles was still very competitive,
right,
in this unknown track, him just giving it all, and he actually pushed quite a bit. When you talk about Mercedes and Aston, comparing those two, I wouldn't have put those two pieces together until you said that. So that's really good information. So then, okay, let's talk about Williams, since we kind of moved on to more of the development and general lessons learned. What would you say about them?
Well, number one, very impressed. They're the little team that punched way above its weight. James Voles had come out and said, hey, we're like 20 years behind in our facilities, or some crazy deal like that. Like 20 years behind. How do you get caught up with that? But that said, Voles has clearly created an atmosphere within that team that has provided like the safe haven for people to go and try things. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't work. And so that little team has exceeded, I'll bet, everybody's expectations, including the ownership of Williams. I would also say that, Alex Albon may be the driver of the year, because that guy took a car that was clearly not one of the best cars out there, and he pulled that thing up the field quite well. And it's just a great story. I'm super impressed. I'm gonna be interested to see what they do next year. I hope they keep up the pace, because they were there towards the end of the year, and I realize it depends on the track and all this kind of stuff, but they clearly are moving into being a really solid contender in the midfield.
I agree. I mean, I think I said this in one of our early episodes. I'm a fan of Williams. I think the historic aspect of it, for sure, leads me to want to see them rise up like a phoenix. And then I've found I'm a James Vowles fan as well. I think, and going back to the Braun GP, it was interesting to realize his roots come from Braun. And I had always just associated him with Mercedes, and then to see he had been a part of the Braun world, and to see his demeanor even in that context. He's a very even-keeled personality, almost. It's going to sound kind of insulting, like he can kind of put you to sleep, because his volume does not change when he even, gets excited. And then when he comes on, like this Abu Dhabi race, he was the team principal that would pop in during free practice and talk, give those live moments of commentary. And he's just so calm. And I thought to myself, what a smart decision of Williams to bring someone with, I had thought that before, but then today, just kind of reflecting, I thought, what a smart decision to bring him on board with his longevity and honor towards what Williams has, but also he's seen the ups and downs, and it's a good steady hand to have to bring you out. And I hope that that he will continue to be able to find those places of incremental, which in the aggregate will bring the actual success, versus trying to just pull it all the way out, I think was what everybody was hoping for, like this dramatic change, but incremental, but sufficient. He seems like he understands having attainable goals that also push you just a little bit.
Right.
And so that, I think, hopefully will work well for them even in the winter break. Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, Sabrina@2guys8girlandf1.com. New to the podcast? If so, take some time to catch our earlier episodes. We think if you're a new or casual fan of F1, then you'll benefit from our F1 101 episode. You might also enjoy our series Deep Dives with Dick. If you want to learn a little bit more about John, Dick, and me, then you might enjoy our individual episodes where we discuss our F1 origin stories. And with that, let me say, that ends this conversation. But rest assured, we'll keep talking, and you can keep listening in, because we're just two guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.